There was a clause in a will that no one had thought necessary to mention to her. There was a duke who might have offered for her openly and had chosen, for reasons that made sense only at 3 in the morning, not to do so. And there was a woman who was at that moment folding a grey silk gown with the quiet efficiency of one who has closed an account and is ready to depart. The clause had been read aloud in the morning room at Wexley on a Tuesday, while the fire made its small, domestic noises and no one thought to close the door. The attorney read the words in the voice trained on the reading of wills. Lavinia repeated them in the voice trained on the reading of nothing at all. Cassandra read them a third time with the bright expectancy of a young woman describing a menu. The harp had gone to Lavinia, who could not play it. The mare had gone to Cassandra, who preferred carriages. The pearls, folded in tissue that smelled faintly of camphor and the summers of a woman 35 years dead, lay upon the walnut table like an argument that had won without needing to be made. What remained, the discretionary residue, the thin, cold coin at the bottom of the purse, had been placed by the late Earl of Wexley into the keeping of a man his youngest daughter had met precisely twice. That was where the story could have ended. It did not. April in the year of our Lord 1814 came late to Wexley Court, in the county of Wiltshire, where the yew hedges kept their winter attitude 2 weeks longer than the almanac permitted. Honoria Fane was 27, dressed in the grey silk she wore for occasions requiring neither mourning nor celebration, with a small brown spaniel of no particular breeding asleep across her slippers and a piece of ink-mended lace in her lap. She had the kind of face that improved on second acquaintance, a mouth that had learned early to keep its own counsel, and eyes that betrayed neither surprise at what had just been read nor any intention of asking for it to be read again. Tell me in the comments from what city in the world you are listening to this story, the hour where you are. I read every one of them. And if these tales of dukes and ladies make your heart breathe a little slower at the end of a long day, leave your subscription here at the door of the channel. It is my quiet way of knowing that you have come back. This is a work of fiction set in the England of the Regency. The characters, the names, and the situations are wholly imagined. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is nothing but coincidence. The attorney folded his spectacles. The stepmother, Lady Wexley that had been, folded her hands. Cassandra, 24, and the more decorative of the two half-sisters, laid the will upon the table as one lays down a winning card and did not look at Honoria. Lavinia, elder of the pair by 11 months and married 2 seasons since to a baronet in Kent, said, "He cannot mean marriage." "He cannot mean anything else," said Cassandra. Honoria continued to mend the sleeve. The lace was of a design her mother had worked before her marriage. The mending was of her own devising and could not be seen at more than 3 paces. She said, without raising her head, "He may mean whatever he chooses. It is the privilege attaching to 25,000 a year." The attorney coughed, in the manner of attorneys who have been paid to cough at precisely that moment. "The discretionary residue, Miss Fane, is not the whole of the settled portion. It is what remains after the specified bequests, and it has been placed at the express direction of the late Earl in the hands of the Duke of Ravensmere, who is to distribute it, in writing, to such person as he shall name." "To such person," Honoria repeated. "To such person. And has His Grace named that person?" The attorney looked at his spectacles as though they might answer for him. "His Grace has requested," he said at last, "the honour of your company at Ravensmere House, Bruton Street, upon Thursday next at 10 of the morning, upon a matter touching your father's testament, the disposal of the residue, and a proposal, the word is underlined once, without emphasis, which he does not choose to entrust to paper." Lavinia sat down rather suddenly, as one who has forgotten that she was already sitting. Cassandra's colour rose, which was her most reliable talent, and Lady Wexley made the small, dry sound with which she was accustomed to greet the arrival of unexpected weather. Honoria set her needle in the fold of the lace. She thought of the pearls in their tissue, of the harp under its holland cover in the yellow drawing-room, of the little bay mare called Miranda that had been bought for her 10th birthday and grazed now, unridden, in the paddock beyond the ha-ha. She thought of a Tuesday morning 8 years past, when she had been 19 and her father, ill already, had said to her across the same walnut table, "I have provided for you as best I could." She had not asked what he meant, because at 19 one does not. "Thursday," she said, "at 10. Very well." She rose. The spaniel, feeling his pillow depart, stretched with the slow, philosophic sigh of a creature aware that all comforts in this world are temporary, and followed her from the room. "Honoria," said Lavinia at the door, "you will not disgrace us." "I have never yet found the occasion," said Honoria without turning, "on which I might." She went upstairs to the room that had been hers since the age of 6, and stood at the window that gave onto the rebuilt part of the south garden, where her father had ordered a sunken parterre planted with white roses in the year her mother died. The roses had never taken, there was a mist on the yews, and a robin had made itself important on the sundial. She thought quite plainly, so this is how it begins. She did not weep. She had passed, on some Tuesday she could no longer name, the age at which the tears of well-bred women were considered picturesque. There was a letter in the writing case that had been her mother's, from the Duke of Ravensmere. It had come the previous morning by hand, with the black wax and the intaglio ring that half of London recognized at 10 paces. She had opened it, read it once, folded it along its original creases, and placed it beneath a stack of unfinished correspondence. She took it out now and read it a second time. "Madame, you will, I believe, receive within the week a communication from Messrs. Threfland and Grieve concerning the disposition of your late father's estate. Certain matters touching the residue require, in my view, more than a lawyer's pen. I request the honour of your presence at Ravensmere House on Thursday the 21st at 10 in the morning. A carriage will be sent, if agreeable, at 9:30. R." The hand was alarming in its neatness, the manner curt to the edge of rudeness but no further, and the single initial where a duke might have written his full name and his 8 subsidiary titles was, she thought, either the mark of arrogance or of a man who has already spent his morning in a longer letter to a subordinate. She did not yet know him well enough to say which. She had met him twice. Once at the Wexley wedding of Lavinia 3 seasons past, where he had stood at the far end of the receiving line with the expression of a man calculating the shortest tolerable time between arrival and departure, had bowed over her gloved hand with perfect civility, and had said "Miss Fane," in a voice that suggested her name had already been given to him more than once. Once at a small musical evening at the house of a mutual cousin, where she had played the pianoforte badly and Cassandra had sung well, and he had stood on the other side of the room in a coat the colour of a rainy Wednesday, and had, at the end of the evening, said, "You do not play, Miss Fane," and she had said, "I do, I merely do not play in public," and he had said, "That is a distinction," and had bowed and had gone. 2 occasions. On the strength of 2 occasions, her father had confided into his keeping the residue of a fortune, and it now seemed the disposal of her own person as well. She did not, that night, dine downstairs. Ravensmere House on Bruton Street stood at the corner where Mayfair contrived, by keeping its shutters painted and its steps swept, to preserve the illusion that London had not, in the 15 years since the century turned, entirely lost its manners. The house was of grey Portland stone, with 3 windows above a portico, and an air of having been built, in 1748, upon the assumption that all future centuries would show it the deference to which it had grown accustomed. Honoria was set down from a hired chaise at 9:50. She had refused the ducal carriage on grounds of principle she did not entirely understand, and would not, if pressed, have defended. The rain, which had held off for London's morning traffic, began the moment she stepped from the vehicle, and she went up the shallow steps with her cloak drawn close and the small brown veil of her bonnet already dark at the edge. The door opened before she had raised the knocker. The butler was of the vintage of the house. His face bore, with dignity, the expression of a man who has seen 3 generations of masters and finds the current one on the whole an improvement. "Miss Fane," he said, "His Grace is expecting you, if you will be so good as to follow me." The library into which she was shown smelled of leather and rain. It ran the depth of the house with a gallery of iron treads on the far wall, a bay window looking upon a paved garden set with a single fig tree, and a fire built low. Books stood in the disciplined regiments of a room used every day rather than for effect. Upon a table near the fire lay a decanter, 2 glasses that had not been touched, and a folded document tied with the tape used by attorneys of the more expensive sort. The Duke of Ravensmere was standing at the far end of the room, near the window. He was in dark blue, without ornament, and had the appearance of a man who had been reading for some hours and had risen upon the striking of the clock rather than the announcement of her name. He was 36, tall, with the kind of hair that was black in shadow and grew lighter at the temples where it caught the day. His face was long and formal, and made, when he was still, no attempt to be pleasing. His eyes were grey. He crossed the room with the walk of a man who had learned to move without wasting motion. "Miss Fane," he said, "you are punctual." "I was raised to it," she answered. "So I understood." He gestured to a chair opposite his own, on the near side of the fire. She sat because refusing to sit would have made the room too small for both of them. She did not remove her gloves. She did not immediately meet his eyes. He remained standing for a moment longer than necessary. "Your father wrote a clause," he said, "that he did not mean you to read." "So I understand." "I would rather have burned it," he said, "than let it be read to you in that room by those persons on a Tuesday." Somewhere in the house a clock, older than her patience, struck the hour. She had come prepared, she thought, for many things. She had not come prepared to be spoken to with the expression of a man who had already imagined in some detail what the reading in that room by those persons on that Tuesday must have been like. "Then perhaps, Your Grace," she said, "you had better tell me what he meant." He sat down. He did not send for coffee. He did not offer her wine. He drew from the folded document a single sheet, closely written on both sides in the same neat hand as the letter, and set it upon the table between them without pushing it towards her. "Your father," he said, "was persuaded in the last year of his life that he had not provided for his youngest daughter in a manner consistent with either her deserts or the affection he bore her. He was, however, restrained by 2 considerations. The first was a promise made some 28 years ago to his second wife concerning the equitable disposition of the settled portion between all 3 of his daughters. The second was his conviction that the eldest and second daughters would, upon his death, take such liberties with the fair dealing implied by that promise as to render the letter of it useless and the spirit of it a mockery." "He was not wrong," she said. "He was not wrong." He paused for the small acknowledgement of that and continued. "He came to me in September of the year 12, upon a matter of some tenants of mine in Wiltshire who boarded his land. Over the course of that autumn, we had occasion to speak several times of your family. In November, he asked whether I would consent to be named in his will as the trustee of a discretionary residue. I said I would consent, upon the understanding that the discretion was to be exercised in favor of yourself. He said that was precisely his intention." "And the sum?" £12,000 in the 4%. rather less than the settled portion your sisters received, rather more than would have been possible to divert to you without provoking, at the reading, the scene which I understand did indeed occur." She looked at the sheet on the table between them. She did not touch it. "That was kind of him," she said, "in his way." "It was frightened of him," said the Duke, "which is a form of kindness that comes late and is worth what it costs." She looked up at that. It was not the answer of a man who had rehearsed. It was the answer of a man who had, in some private accounting, arrived at the sum himself. There was something in the way he said the word frightened that suggested he had, on occasion, felt the same about his own father and would not go into it further. "Very well," she said, 12,000 in the 4%. "It is more than I expected and less than my sisters received. I am, upon the whole, satisfied. I do not see, your Grace, why this required my presence in Bruton Street. A letter from Messrs. Threfland would have served." "It would have," he said, "but the proposal would not." She was silent. He did not at once go on. He sat looking at the fire and at the toe of his boot, which he had rested without particular intention on the fender. He was, she thought, not a man used to explaining himself. He had the look of one for whom explanation was a form of expense he had grown unused to incurring. "Miss Fane," he said, "there is nothing in your father's will that obliges you to marry anyone. I do not wish you to be sitting in my library under the misapprehension that there is. The 12,000 is yours upon my signature, which I will give this afternoon, whether or not you and I ever meet again after this hour." "That is generous. It is legal," he said. "There is a distinction." She permitted herself then the beginning of a smile, small, formal, not offered, and he saw it and did not acknowledge it, and went on. "The proposal is separate. It is a private matter between us, and it will remain so, regardless of your answer. In April of last year, at Lady Fenmere's musical evening in Charles Street, you told me that you played but did not play in public. I have remembered that. I have found, upon consideration, that I do not care to make an offer of marriage in public either. I do not care to make one in an assembly room, upon a terrace, in a garden set for the purpose, or upon my knee. I wish, Miss Fane, to make you an offer here this morning in this library, in dry weather clothes, with the fire burning low and no witness except that clock, on the understanding that you will take a week to consider it, and that if you refuse me, you will keep this hour to yourself as scrupulously as I shall keep it to myself." He raised his eyes then and looked at her fully. "I have chosen you," he said, "because I believe I could live in the same house as you for 40 years without wearying of your silences. I do not ask you to say the same of mine. I ask only that you consider whether you could bear them long enough to try." The fire settled with a small sound. Somewhere in the street a wheel passed over a loose cobble. She sat with her hands folded in her lap upon the grey silk that had been chosen for occasions requiring neither mourning nor celebration. And she thought, "This is not the room I dressed for." She said, "Your Grace, may I ask a question?" "You may ask several." "Why?" He looked at her for a moment, as though he had been prepared for any question but that one, and then, having recognized the question, had also recognized that he had been prepared for it all along, and had simply hoped he would not be required to answer. "Because," he said, "in this year, in this city, in this house, I have found no one else in whose company I can be silent." She did not answer at once. He did not press her. Outside, the rain had increased. It made upon the paved garden a small, steady noise, like a person reading aloud in another room. "A week," she said. "A week from today." "At what hour?" "At the same hour, if you will." "I will." She rose. He rose. He walked her to the door of the library and stopped there. He did not offer his arm. He did not offer any further conversation. He said, at the threshold, in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, "Miss Fane, whatever your answer, the 12,000 is yours today. That is not part of the proposal. I would not have you confuse the two." "I do not confuse them," she said. The butler was in the hall. Her cloak had been dried by a fire in the servants' hall and returned to her with the small, superior care of a household that knew its business. She stepped down into Bruton Street. The rain had passed. The pavement shone. She walked in the end back to her cousin's house in Half Moon Street, rather than take a chair, because she required the distance and the air, and because she did not, at that moment, wish to be enclosed with her own thoughts in any conveyance smaller than a city. The week that followed had, in retrospect, the shape of a corridor she was walking down in the dark, with doors on either side that she could hear but not see. Her cousin, Mrs. Pelham, a widow of 45, whose small house in Half Moon Street had for 6 years served Honoria as the refuge to which one retreated when the family at Wexley became too much for reason, asked no questions on Thursday. On Friday she asked one. It was, "Did you like him?" Honoria was at the writing table. She was answering, with the care she gave to all correspondence, a letter from the vicar's wife at Wexley concerning the annual distribution of blankets to the parish poor. She said, without looking up, "I do not know. That is not, I think, quite the right question." "What is the right question?" "Whether I could bear his silence." Mrs. Pelham, who was of the generation that had married for love and been on the whole disappointed, set down her sewing. "Honoria," she said, "at 27 a woman does not marry for silence." "At 27, said Honoria, "she marries for whatever she can bear." The letter arrived on Saturday. It was addressed to Miss H. Fane at Half Moon Street in the neat hand she had begun, with slight alarm, to be able to identify at 10 paces. It contained a single sheet. "Madam, I forgot yesterday to say that at Ravensmere Court the library is kept at 16 degrees of Réaumur. It is, I am told, warmer than most, and I mention it in case you are one of those persons who feel the cold in libraries. R." She read it 3 times. She could not, at first, arrive at what it meant. On the 3rd reading, she understood that it meant she was to imagine herself, at some future date, reading in a library that had been kept at a temperature calibrated for her comfort. She folded it along its creases and put it beneath the vicar's wife's letter, and, on further thought, took it out and put it in the writing case with her mother's older correspondence, and, on still further thought, transferred it to the small inner pocket of her spencer, where it stayed for the remainder of the week. On Monday, she received an invitation to a small evening party at the house of Lady Osbaldiston. The invitation was written in Lady Osbaldiston's own hand, which was famous for its size and its bad temper. At the foot, in a smaller and better hand, it said, "Ravensmere will be there." Oh. Lady Osbaldiston was Alaric's aunt on his mother's side, a woman of 70 who had, in the year 1784, married an earl, and had, in every year since, made the earl regret it. She was a great friend of Mrs. Pelham. She was not, in the ordinary sense, a friend of Honoria's, but she had, at Lavinia's wedding, looked at Honoria across the receiving line with the expression of a woman appraising a fabric, and had said later to Mrs. Pelham, "The younger one has a spine. Keep an eye on her." Honoria showed the invitation to Mrs. Pelham. "You will go," said Mrs. Pelham. "I had thought I might not. You will go. Osbaldiston does not invite where she does not want, and Ravensmere does not attend where he does not want. And you, my dear, do not sit in Half Moon Street on Monday evenings, picking at a piece of lace, when a matter of some magnitude has been laid before you, and you have not yet decided whether it is a mountain or a molehill. You do not know what has been laid before me. I know it involved a carriage sent at 9:30 and a letter in a hand I would recognize at 100 paces upon a haystack. I do not require particulars. You will wear the blue." She wore the blue. Lady Osbaldiston's drawing-room was of the kind that made no concession to fashion, because fashion had, in the year 1790, ceased to concern its owner. There were 17 candles too many. There were 3 portraits of dead husbands, none of whom had lived to see the third. There was, in the second saloon, a card table already occupied by 4 ladies engaged in a quiet and vicious game of loo. And there was, in a corner near the window that gave onto Grosvenor Street, Alaric Fenchurch, 6th Duke of Ravensmere, standing beside his aunt, with the expression of a man who had come in the strict fulfillment of a family duty and would remain for the exact number of minutes the fulfillment required. He saw her come in. He did not at once cross to her. He inclined his head half an inch from across the room and then returned his attention to his aunt with the courtesy of a man who had been raised to know that a party belonged to its hostess and that any prior claim on his conversation must wait upon her convenience. It was the aunt who crossed to her. Lady Osbaldiston moved through her own drawing-room with the unhurried authority of a queen who has been on the throne so long she has forgotten there was ever a time she was not. She took Honoria's hands, examined her at the length of her own outstretched arms, and said, "Yes, I told Pelham the Blue." "You told Mrs. Pelham the Blue. Mrs. Pelham is my god-cousin twice removed, and my correspondent on the subject of dressmakers of 29 years' standing. Come here, sit by me. My nephew is going to talk to a bishop for half an hour because I have asked him to, and then he is going to walk you to the small saloon on the pretext of seeing the miniature of my mother, because I have also asked him to, and then he is going to say to you what he ought to have said in Bruton Street on Thursday morning, but was, I am given to understand, incapable of saying at that hour. You are given to understand." "I am given to understand," said Lady Osbaldiston, "that my nephew has in the last week been sleeping badly. That is not a proposal, madam. It is the beginning of one. I have known him since he was 3 days old. I have watched him sleep badly under many kinds of provocation. The kind that concerns you is a new one. Sit down." She sat down. She thought quite distinctly, so this is how it is done, in this year, in this city. The bishop was talked to. The half-hour passed. There was, from the far end of the room, the small, polite laughter of a set of well-bred people who were not enjoying themselves. And then, at some undetermined moment, Alaric was at her elbow saying, "Miss Fane, my aunt wishes you to see a miniature of her mother, which is in the small saloon. Will you allow me to conduct you?" "Certainly." He offered his arm. She took it. They passed through the folding doors into a small saloon lit by 4 candles and no fire. There was, upon the wall between the 2 windows, a miniature of a woman in a powdered coiffure and a rose silk gown, painted by the length of the powdered curls, sometime about the year 1750. There was also, upon the marble table beneath, a bowl of white hyacinths whose scent had begun, in the closed air, to be too much. He did not, at first, speak. He stood beside her looking at the miniature with the expression of a man who had seen it every year of his life since he was a child, and had come, at length, to see it not at all. "My aunt," he said, "believes she has arranged a matter. Your aunt is under a misapprehension." "My aunt is under no misapprehension of any kind. That has been the trouble with her for 70 years. He paused. "Miss Fane, I do not wish, this evening, to press you for the answer you were to give me on Thursday. I wish only to say that a certain business of mine will oblige me to leave London upon the 11th of May for the north of Yorkshire, and I shall not return before the end of June. If you find, in that period, that your answer is not the one I hoped for, I ask that you write to Threfland, who will not, in his letter to me, mention your name. If your answer is the one I hoped for, I ask that you write to me directly at Ravensmere Court, and I shall come south. You will come south. I shall come south. That is a long ride. It is a ride I should be glad to make." He did not turn his head to look at her. He was, she thought, on the other side of a distance he had not been able in the last week to shorten. He had chosen that evening to stand at the miniature rather than at the fire. because the fire would have required him to look at her, and looking at her would have required him to say what he had said in Bruton Street and would not say again this week. She said, "Your Grace." "Miss Fane, I have not yet decided. I will not decide upon a Monday in your aunt's drawing room, before a bowl of hyacinths that is making my head ache. I will write to you when the week is out." "Very well. But I will say this," she said. "The letter you sent me on Saturday concerning the temperature of the library at Ravensmere Court was—" He waited. She could see, in the very slight tightening of the muscle at the angle of his jaw, that he was preparing, out of some habit older than her acquaintance, for a rebuff. "The kindest letter," she finished, "that I have ever received." He did not answer. He was silent for so long that she thought he had not heard her, and then, when she looked at him, she saw that he had heard her perfectly, and was engaged in the small private work of not permitting his face to alter. "Then," he said at length, "I shall write more of them." He did not write more of them in the sense of many. He wrote in the week that followed, one. It arrived on the Friday at Half Moon Street, in the same hand, and said, "Madam, I forgot yesterday to say that the water at Ravensmere is soft, and the coffee in consequence better than it is in London. I would not have you decide upon insufficient information. R." She read it aloud without meaning to at the writing table. Mrs. Pelham, seated across the room with her sewing, looked up. "Honoria." "Yes? That is a strange young man. He is 36. He is a strange young man of 36. "Yes," said Honoria. She folded the letter along its creases and put it with the other in the inner pocket of her spencer, where they made together a small stiff square that she could feel through the silk when she sat down. On the Sunday evening she wrote to him. She sat down at the writing table at 8, dismissed Mrs. Pelham to her chamber with a firmness that surprised them both, and did not rise from her chair until 10:30. She used 4 sheets of paper before she was satisfied. The letter, in the end, said, "Your Grace, you have asked me to consider whether I could bear your silences. I have considered it. I find that I can, upon 2 conditions. The first is that you will bear mine, which are, I am told by those who ought to know, of a length and obstinacy remarkable in a woman my age. The second is that neither of us will pretend, in the presence of the other, to a warmth we have not yet earned, and that we shall permit ourselves the time in which to earn it, without measuring the time by any standard except our own. Upon these conditions, I accept. H.F." She sealed it with the smaller of her mother's 2 seals, which bore a lily and no motto, and directed it to His Grace the Duke of Ravensmere at Ravensmere Court, in the North Riding of Yorkshire, and gave it to Mrs. Pelham's footman, with instructions to see it into the 8 o'clock mail on Monday morning. She did not at that hour feel what she had expected to feel. She felt instead as she had felt as a child of 10 when she had first crossed a stream on a plank laid between 2 stones, and had discovered, upon reaching the far side, that she was already there. He came south on the 22nd of June, arriving at Bruton Street at 4 in the afternoon in a travelling coach that had covered upwards of 200 miles in the previous 40 hours. He sent, at 4:30, a note to Half Moon Street that said only, "I am here. May I come to you at 6? R." And he was at Half Moon Street at 6, in a coat he had changed once, with the expression of a man who had not slept, who had not eaten, and who had, upon the North Road at Grantham, been overtaken by a thunderstorm which had done nothing to improve his complexion. Mrs. Pelham received him in the drawing-room. She asked no questions. She said, "His Grace, Miss Fane," in the tone of a woman handing a plate of great value to a servant she had chosen carefully, and withdrew. He stood in the middle of the drawing-room. Honoria was at the window. She did not at once cross to him. "Miss Fane," he said, "Your Grace." "I have your letter." "So I gathered, from the fact of your being here." He did not smile. He was too tired to smile. He said in a voice that was almost inaudible, "I did not, until I read it, know that I had been afraid." "Of what?" "That you would think me a man who bought his wife with £12,000 in the 4%. "I did not think that," she said. "I know, but I did not know until I read your letter that I had thought you might." They stood then on either side of the drawing room, at a distance neither of them attempted to close, and she saw for the first time, as clearly as if the light had shifted in the room, though it had not, that he was not, and had never been, the shut door his reputation had made of him. He was a man who had learned early to keep the door shut, because the room behind it was too warm for the manners of Mayfair, and had, at 36, only just begun to consider that the door might, in company he trusted, be opened as far as an inch. "Well," she said, "you are here. Sit down. Mrs. Pelham will send in tea." He sat down. She rang the bell. The evening had upon it thereafter the kind of ordinariness that betrays itself only in retrospect. They drank tea. They spoke at first of the road from Yorkshire, and then, upon her inquiry, of the tenants at Ravensmere, whose small industries he had been in the north to inspect, and then, upon his inquiry, of the parish blanket distribution at Wexley, which she had, before her removal to town, organized for 7 years, and in which he professed, in the polite voice of a man who has never in his life given a moment's thought to a blanket, a courteous and specific interest. At 7:30, Mrs. Pelham returned to the drawing-room and sat with them, and the conversation broadened to include the state of the roads in the West Riding, and the character of one Mr. Wilberforce's latest speech in Parliament. At 9 he rose, took his leave with an old-fashioned formality that seemed in the smaller drawing-room, larger than it had done at Bruton Street, and departed. He came again upon the following morning at 10, and again at 3, and again upon the Friday. There was no announcement in the Morning Post. There was, in fact, no announcement anywhere. And Wexley, upon receiving from the attorney the plain statement that Miss Honoria Fane had been paid over the sum of £12,000 in the 4%, in accordance with the exercise of a discretion vested in the trustee, wrote to Mrs. Pelham, upon the initiative of the stepmother, an inquiry of such a shape that Mrs. Pelham read it aloud at breakfast, and remarked that a woman who could disguise ill will so poorly ought not to attempt it in a letter. The stepmother's inquiry in substance was this: was it true, as one had heard whispered in 3 separate drawing-rooms of Grosvenor Square, that the Duke of Ravensmere had been seen paying a morning call in Half Moon Street on 3 consecutive days? And if so, was it, in Mrs. Pelham's opinion, a matter of family business connected to the settlement of the late Earl's affairs? Or was it a matter of some other and more particular kind, upon which the family of the young person concerned might reasonably expect to be consulted? Honoria read the letter twice. She said at last, "She has heard, then." "Grosvenor Square," said Mrs. Pelham, "hears everything, and then holds it up to the light. She will come to town. She will come to town within the week, and Cassandra within the fortnight." Honoria set the letter aside. She thought, with a clarity she had not permitted herself in some weeks, of the walnut table in the morning-room at Wexley, of the pearls in their tissue, of the harp under its holland cover, of the little bay mare grazing unridden in the paddock beyond the ha-ha. She thought of her father, in the year 12, coming down from a September ride to find a man he did not know, standing in the library at Wexley, and choosing, over the course of that autumn, to lay into the hands of that man the disposal of his youngest child's future. It seemed to her in that moment that her father had known his other children rather better than she had ever been prepared to give him credit for. "Very well," she said. "Let them come." The stepmother arrived upon the following Tuesday. She was accompanied by Cassandra, who had elected to travel in the same carriage upon the pretext of choosing bonnets, and the truth of forestalling any tete-a-tete. Lavinia, in Kent, had contented herself with a letter of 8 sides. The stepmother's carriage set them down at the door of Mrs. Pelham's house in Half Moon Street at 11 of the morning on Tuesday, the 5th of July, in a heat that had come upon London in the small hours, and had not by 11 decided whether it meant to remain. Cassandra was in yellow. She was, at 24, still what the newspapers described as a beauty of the season, and she carried the description with the ease of a woman who had never been required to consider what might come after it. Her voice, as she was announced, filled the small saloon with the confidence of a young person entering a room she had inspected in advance and had found, upon inspection, entirely to her measure. Honoria. Cassandra. You are very well, I see. Half Moon Street agrees with you. Half Moon Street, said Honoria, has agreed with me these 6 years. Yes, of course. Cassandra sat down. She arranged her yellow skirts with the small care that had been, in the walnut morning room 3 months previously, the outward sign of a young woman being read a will. Mamma will be with us in a moment. She is having a word with Mrs. Pelham upon the subject of a shawl. A shawl. A shawl. It is a matter of some moment. You know how Mamma is upon shawls. I do. There was a pause. The clock in the corner ticked. From the street came the small, perpetual sounds of a London afternoon. A barrel organ, a boy calling a paper, the wheels of a hackney upon the cobbles. Cassandra looked at her half-sister across the small saloon with the expression of a young woman who had, in the carriage from Wiltshire, prepared several openings and could not, now the moment had come, remember which of them she had elected to use. She chose at length the one Honoria had been expecting from the moment the carriage had drawn up. Honoria, she said, you must tell me. It is not fair that I should have to hear it from Lady Osbaldistone's second cousin's companion, who tells it to my milliner, who tells it to me. Is it true that the Duke of Ravensmere is to marry you? Cassandra. Is it true? Honoria did not at once answer. She looked at Cassandra as, across all the years of their shared childhood, she had looked at her precisely twice. Once, when Cassandra had, aged 9, taken the little bay mare from the paddock and ridden her without permission into the North Lane and been thrown, and once, when Cassandra had, aged 18, laughed at a joke of a young viscount's that had, in its whole intention, been at her elder sister's expense. She had looked at Cassandra upon both occasions with a steadiness that had produced in the younger girl the small, unwelcome sensation of having been seen more clearly than she had bargained for. She looked at her that way now. It is true, she said, that the Duke of Ravensmere has done me the honour of asking me to marry him, and that I have accepted. Cassandra sat quite still. When? She said. A month ago. A month ago? Yes. And you did not think to inform your family? I did not think, said Honoria quietly, that my family was upon this matter my family. Cassandra rose. Cassandra was, in this moment, doing the thing she did well, the thing that had been, throughout the whole of her 19 years upon the stage of the family, her one indisputable talent. She was rising in the yellow gown with the small offended dignity of a young woman who has been, without warning, made to feel that she is not the centre of the room. Honoria, she said, you did not think. You had a duty. You had a duty to Mamma, who has been to you as a mother, Cassandra, and a duty to me, who have been to you as a sister, Cassandra, and a duty to Lavinia, who, Cassandra, said Honoria. If you finish that sentence, you will not tomorrow be able to look me in the eye. Sit down. Cassandra did not at first sit down. She stood in the yellow gown, with a small shining tear at the corner of one eye, which she had summoned with the practised skill of one who had, upon many previous occasions, found the summoning of it useful. Honoria watched the tear. She thought, with the exhaustion of many years, that she had never, in the whole of their acquaintance, seen Cassandra weep in a room in which no one was watching. "Sit down," she said again. Cassandra sat down. "You will," said Honoria, "hear me. You will hear me because I am, at 27, in possession of my own person and my own fortune, and because you are, at 24, still in possession of neither. You took the harp, you took the mare, you took, though it was not in the will, the greater part of the linen from the yellow closet at Wexley, on the pretext that Lavinia had need of it in Kent. You have taken, over the course of the 24 years I have known you, whatever you could reach. I have not, in that time, reproached you. I do not reproach you now. I state a fact. Our father, in the year 12, arrived, by paths I do not know and shall not inquire into, at the conclusion that the settled portion he had made would be, upon his death, divided in a manner he did not intend. He arrived, in consequence, at the further conclusion that the residue was better placed in the hands of a stranger than in the hands of his family. He has been proved, in every particular, correct. That is not a matter for your grief, Cassandra. It is a matter for mine. I have accepted the Duke of Ravensmere because he asked me. He asked me for reasons of his own, which he has explained to me, and which I have, upon reflection, chosen to believe. I have not accepted him for his title, of which I have no use, nor for his fortune, of which I have less, nor for his person, which is not, and I think will never be, of the kind that turns heads at a ball. I have accepted him because I believe I could sit at his table for 40 years and not weary of his silences, and because he believes, upon his own account, the same of mine. If, in the 24 years to come, that proves to have been a mistake, I shall bear it. I shall not, however, bear it in advance, and I shall not bear it under interrogation from a young woman who has, in the whole of her acquaintance with him, spoken to him upon the subject of the weather and no other. Cassandra was silent. The stepmother in the doorway had been silent also. She had been silent, in fact, for the whole of the last 3/4 of the speech, having entered upon the words, "taken the greater part of the linen," and having found, upon entering, that the small saloon was a room she did not, for the moment, know how to enter further. "Well," said Lady Wexley. "Well." She came into the small saloon. She sat down. "Well," she said a third time, "you have grown, Honoria." "I have not grown, madam. I have been for a long time this height." Lady Wexley looked at her stepdaughter across the small saloon. She was a woman of 53, in a lilac day gown, with a face that had in youth been pretty in the untroubled way of country girls with good complexions, and had, at 53, acquired the small permanent lines of a woman who had, for 30 years, been in the habit of arranging her expression before entering a room. She said at last, in a voice that was neither warm nor cold, but had in it the small, unwilling respect of one who has recognized, upon meeting it, an obstacle she had not been prepared to meet, "It is a great match." "It is a match," said Honoria. "You will be a duchess." "I shall be his wife. The other, I take it, follows." "You will be presented." "I shall be presented." "You will require," said Lady Wexley, upon a small, dry note in which one heard the ghost of a laugh that was not quite there, "a great many gowns." "I shall require the ones I can bear to wear." Lady Wexley looked at her a moment longer. It was, of that moment, difficult to say what she saw. Perhaps she saw the child of 6 who had come, in the year of her marriage to the Earl, from the schoolroom at Wexley Cottage to the schoolroom at Wexley Court, and had never, in the 20 years thereafter, given her any trouble that could be described in a letter. Perhaps she saw the daughter of the first Countess of Wexley, whom she had never met, and had, from long and unnecessary hearsay, come to regard as a rival. Perhaps she saw, quite simply, a woman she had never before had the leisure to consider as a woman. She rose. She smoothed the lilac skirts. "Well," she said, "you will do as you must. I shall write to Lavinia. Do. At the door of the small saloon, with Cassandra already in the hall, she paused. She turned back. Honoria. Madam, your father, said Lady Wexley, did love you. I know he did. He was not a man who could— I know, said Honoria. Thank you, madam. Lady Wexley inclined her head half an inch and withdrew. The engagement was announced in the Morning Post on the 9th of July. It was announced in 3 lines of the smallest civil type. It named in the manner of the paper the parties, the fathers, the seats. It did not, in the manner of the paper, name the fortune. It was read at breakfast tables from Grosvenor Square to Cheapside, in the manner of a piece of news that had, though everyone had known it for a fortnight, arrived only now in the form that permitted them to admit they had known it. The season at that hour was upon its last legs. London had begun to empty. The Duke and Miss Fane were engaged, in the fortnight that followed, in the small, unending business of receiving morning calls from persons who had, in 6 of the last 7 seasons, not called at all. Honoria bore it with the tranquil efficiency of one who had, in youth, been trained to it, and had, in middle youth, found the training useful. The Duke bore it, at least in her presence, with the expression of a man who had recognized the necessity, had assented to it, and would not upon any account permit it to alter the temperature of the library. There was in that fortnight one incident. It occurred at the ball given by the Duchess of Grafton upon the 16th of July, the last great ball of the season, at which everyone who intended to be seen was seen, and everyone who intended to see was seen also. Lady Serena Price was there. Lady Serena was 27, the same age as Honoria. She had, 4 seasons past, been considered upon the whole of the female side of Mayfair, the young woman who would, in due course, be Duchess of Ravensmere. She had not, upon that occasion, been asked. She had, upon each of the 3 seasons that had followed, waited, with the small, courteous patience of a woman who had been raised to know her value, to be asked. She had not been asked. She had, upon the 10th of July of the present year, opened the Morning Post at her father's breakfast table, and had read 3 lines of the smallest civil type, and had folded the paper, and had said in the tone she used for the servants, "I shall not this morning take chocolate." She was in the ballroom of Grafton House upon the 16th of July, in a gown of white silk with silver spangles. She was, upon the entrance of the Duke of Ravensmere and Miss Fane, standing with her mother and 2 younger sisters near the small orchestra, and she did not, upon the entrance, alter her expression by so much as the raising of an eyebrow. She permitted her mother to raise both eyebrows for her. She permitted the 2 younger sisters to whisper. She herself waited in the white silk for the moment at which, in the natural course of the evening, the parties must come within civil-speaking distance of one another, and when the moment came, was ready. She came across the ballroom. She did not, in coming, alter the pace of her walk. Miss Fane, Lady Serena, I have not, in the many years I have known his grace, had the pleasure of your acquaintance. He has, this evening, remedied the fault. She turned half a degree towards Alaric. Your Grace, I offer my congratulations. It is, I understand, a long-standing attachment. She had chosen in long-standing the word most likely to cut. Ravensmere had, in the 4 seasons in which Lady Serena had waited, been seen with Honoria upon precisely 2 occasions. Alaric said, Lady Serena, I thank you. It is an attachment which I had, until this year, not permitted myself to hope for. Miss Fane has been in that respect more generous than I deserved. He said it in the voice in which he had 4 seasons past not asked, and Lady Serena, who was as intelligent as her mother's ambition, and had not, for 4 years, been permitted to admit it in the presence of a man, heard the whole of what was in it, and answered in the same voice, Then I hope, Miss Fane, that you will find him as constant to your service as he has been on other occasions to his own. She inclined her head. She withdrew. She was, in the withdrawing, seen by half the ballroom to withdraw, and was, in the half-hour following, engaged in 3 consecutive dances with 3 different young men, each of whom went home with the impression that he had, that evening, been particularly favoured. Honoria did not, at the moment of the withdrawal, alter her expression by so much as the raising of an eyebrow. She was aware of the ballroom watching. She was aware of Alaric. On the other side of the small distance, her hand upon his arm did not attempt to close, of what she supposed was a form of anger. She was aware of her own breath, which had, upon the word's long-standing attachment, done a small, unfamiliar thing at the base of her throat. "Miss Fane," said Alaric in a voice pitched to reach her ear and no others, "will you dance?" "With you?" "With me. I do not dance, in general, twice with the same partner. You are engaged to be married to me." "I am aware." "Then the case is altered." "The case is altered," she agreed. She danced with him. She danced with him twice in the same set, at the small distance the figure of the country dance required, and no more. She was, throughout the dance, quite aware that she was being watched by half the room, that half the room was already writing letters in its head to correspondents in Bath, and that Lady Serena, from the small distance of her third partner's arm, was aware of all of it, and would not, upon any account, permit her face to acknowledge that she was aware. At the end of the second dance, he did not lead her from the floor. He said, at the small pause the music permitted, "Miss Fane, I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For a dance 11 years ago in this house, which I did not offer to a young woman of 19 in a grey silk gown, upon the entirely sufficient ground that I did not, in that year, know her name, and for 4 seasons since, in which I did not, upon my own account, correct the omission." "Your Grace." "Yes. It is not on the whole necessary to apologize for a dance you did not know to offer. It is not on the whole. It is, on this occasion, particular." She was silent for a moment. The music was resolving. The set was breaking up. "Very well," she said. "I accept the apology. Let us not upon it become sentimental. There is champagne in the small saloon." "There is. Let us go and drink it." They were married upon the 14th of September at St. George's, Hanover Square, at 10 of the morning, with 52 persons present, of whom 17 were relations, 11 were tenants of Ravensmere brought down at his expense, and the remainder were friends of Mrs. Pelham, of Lady Osbaldeston, and of no one else in particular. Lavinia and Cassandra were both present. Lavinia wept at the correct moments. Cassandra did not weep at any moment, and was, at the wedding breakfast, seated next to a widowed viscount of 45, who owned a house in Berkeley Square, and had, at the age of 22, lost the better part of one thumb in a shooting accident, which he was, in general, willing to describe to any young woman who would listen. Cassandra listened. She was heard, in the carriage back to Grosvenor Square, to remark that the Viscount was a man of great character, and that his manner of holding a fork was, upon consideration, distinctive rather than unfortunate. The stepmother, at the door of St. George's, kissed her stepdaughter upon the cheek. It was, upon their long acquaintance, the first occasion upon which she had done so. Honoria did not, upon the occasion, remark it. Neither did the stepmother. It was, perhaps, sufficient that they were both aware. The wedding journey was to Yorkshire. They travelled in the ducal coach, with 2 outriders and a change of horses at every stage. They stopped, the first night, at Grantham, and the second at Doncaster, and arrived upon the evening of the 17th at the gates of Ravensmere Court in a September light that had, over the last mile of the drive, turned the beech avenue the colour of old copper. The house itself lay in a hollow of the Yorkshire moors, in stone the colour of wet sand, with 3 fronts and 11 bays, and a park of 400 acres bounded on the north by a river she did not know the name of, and on the south by a chapel she had, upon the drawing in his letter, imagined many times. There was, upon the west front, a library that ran the full length of the house, with 2 galleries of iron treads and a bay window looking upon a walled garden set with a single mulberry tree. And there was, in the library, a small round table drawn close to the fire, upon which the housekeeper had laid, at his written direction, 2 glasses of hock and a plate of the cold beef and bread, which was, he had been given to understand, the supper his wife most reliably preferred after a long day upon the road. She stood, upon entering the library, at the door, and looked at the room. "It is 16 degrees of Réaumur," he said behind her. "I had noticed." "You feel the cold?" "Not at present." He came into the room after her. He did not at once close the door. He said, "There is one further matter which I neglected to mention in Bruton Street on Thursday morning." "Yes?" "The pearls." She turned then. "The pearls," he said, "which were, by your father's will, bequeathed to your younger half-sister. I have, in the last month, without your knowledge, and without her participation, caused them to be valued and offered to be repurchased. They are, I am told, in a box in Bruton Street. I did not know, until yesterday, whether you would consent to accept them from me, or whether you would prefer that I sell them to a jeweler in Bond Street and cause the money to be paid into your account. It is upon that point and no other that I have not, in these last 4 months, been able to decide." She looked at him. She looked at him across the small distance of the library that had been, in that year, kept at 16 degrees of Réaumur for her comfort. She thought of the walnut table in the morning room at Wexley, of the tissue that smelled of camphor and the summers of a woman 35 years dead, of the small dry sound with which her stepmother had, upon a Tuesday in April, greeted the reading of the will. She thought of her father in the year 12, coming down from a September ride to find a man he did not know standing in the library at Wexley, and choosing. She said, "You may give them to me." "Very well. I shall not, however, wear them." "I did not suppose that you would." "They will remain in a box upon the top shelf of the closet in whichever bedroom I have the use of, for such of our daughters as may, in the years to come, choose to wear them." "That is a long view." "I take upon the whole long views. I'm glad of it." He came then, at last, across the small distance the library had permitted them. He stopped at arm's length. He said, in the voice he had used at the miniature in Lady Osbaldistone's small saloon, and at the door of the drawing-room in Half Moon Street, and in the letter concerning the coffee, "May I?" She said, "You may." He took her hand. He raised it to his mouth. He did not kiss it. He held it for a moment at the small distance the raising had produced, and then, without kissing it, lowered it and did not let it go. They stood in the library at Ravensmere Court upon the 17th of September in the year of our Lord 1814. In the room he had, in November of the year 12, promised her father he would keep at 16 degrees of Réaumur, without knowing at that hour whether he would ever be permitted to say so. And they were, upon that evening, silent for the length of time it took the housekeeper, in the small still room beyond, to send word that supper was, when convenient, ready in the small dining room upon the west front. She returned to the book. The rain continued, stories told with quiet love. There was a letter with no date that came in the rain of a Wiltshire spring. There was a clause in the will of a man who had, at last, learned to be kind. There was a harp that a stranger played, and a mare that a stranger rode, and a string of pearls in a box on a shelf that no one wore. There was a house in Yorkshire, in stone the colour of wet sand, kept warm at 16 degrees for a woman who felt the cold in libraries. There was a duke who did not know how to speak, and a woman who did not need him to. There was, in the end, a silence they had both, from opposite ends of their lives, been waiting for. There was a letter with no date that came in the rain of a Wiltshire spring. There was a clause in the will of a man who had, at last, learned to be kind. There was a harp that a stranger played, and a mare that a stranger rode, and a string of pearls in a box on a shelf that no one wore. There was a house in Yorkshire in stone the colour of wet sand, kept warm at 16 degrees for a woman who felt the cold in libraries. There was a duke who did not know how to speak, and a woman who did not need him to. There was, in the end, a silence they had both, from opposite ends of their lives, been waiting for. If stories like this keep you company in the quiet hours, leave a comment and a subscription. It is what keeps them being told, here, one after another, without hurry. This is a work of fiction set in the England of the Regency. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is pure coincidence.